Hello and welcome to CNBC Conversation. Microsoft is in the midst of a big turnaround. The company, once synonymous with Windows and Office, now reshaping its identity through Azure and AI. It's also gone after some big tech names like GitHub. In the process, the company has proven it's come a long way since the days of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer.
This company's had 3 CEOs. They're all right here. This is all.
Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer made Microsoft a household name. By the late 1980s, Microsoft's Windows software was running on nearly every PC. The company held up as the poster child of American tech prowess. But an antitrust lawsuit in the mid-90s left Microsoft licking its wounds. By 2014, it was fighting to compete in a space dominated by Amazon and Google. Enter Satya Nadella.
It's really our collective challenge that we now need to make Microsoft thrive in a mobile-first and a cloud-first world.
Nadella's focus on cloud computing and artificial intelligence has won the approval of investors, with Microsoft stock hitting an all-time high. But the company's also embracing a cultural shift.
We believe that cybersecurity needs to be a cause for our time.
The company has spoken out on privacy, AI, and immigration. Leading the charge, President Brad Smith. I sat down with him in Hong Kong. If Microsoft under Steve Ballmer was sort of the 2.0, how would you characterize where the company is right now under Satya Nadella?
What Satya Nadella has really brought to Microsoft in his role as CEO, I think, is a focus on culture. Changing the culture in a way that really unleashes innovation on an ongoing basis. But it's what we call, what many people now refer to as sort of a growth mindset. Something that sort of went from perhaps a place where people thought they should be the know-it-all to a place that really values individuals who want to learn it all.
I want to get into the values bit a little later. What would you say has been the biggest shift? I mean, obviously, we've seen a huge focus on cloud, but since Satya came in 4 years ago, what would you, as somebody who's been with the company for a long time, say was the most fundamental shift that you saw?
Well, I think we've seen 3 things. First, we've seen this sort of sustained progress in our cloud technologies. We were really fortunate, I think, to have Satya become the CEO having led that part of the business. So he was able to bring everything he understood and then figure out how to move that to the rest of the company. The second is what we now call this focus, not just on an intelligent cloud, but an intelligent edge. This notion that we've entered a world where there's going to be intelligence in IoT or Internet of Things devices. There is more intelligence on our phones now. So it's not intelligence in the cloud alone. And then the third ingredient is really AI being infused everywhere. It's being infused into our products and services. But more than that, we are creating a set of platform technologies that any customer can use to build their own AI services.
What's interesting to me is you've got a lot of tech companies who are fighting in this race for AI, who have developed the technology to keep it in-house and apply it to their hardware. Microsoft has taken a bit of a different approach, which is to have the AI tools to help the businesses empower them in some way. Why take that approach?
Well, I think Microsoft's on a mission. We've always been a mission-driven company. Our first mission was to democratize the PC, and by that we meant put a PC literally in every house and on every desk. We're focused on democratizing AI. We really see the key to the future is enabling every government, every business, every nonprofit to use our AI building blocks and create their own AI solutions. I think that is going to be a far better strategy, not just for us as a company, but for the economy and frankly for the world, than just telling people that if they want to use AI, they have to come, do it in some self-contained box that one or just a few tech companies control.
As it relates to AI, I know you've laid out some principles in terms of the ethics, and that's a big debate right now. As we see the technology advance, well, where is the limit there? And in one of those, one of the things that struck me is in the principle you talked about privacy and security, essentially, giving users sort of the permission to use it. What was the conversation within the company as you laid out those principles, and why those 6?
Well, we spend a lot of time asking ourselves, first of all, what is the role of ethics in AI? We think it's profound because we're at a moment in time when humanity is in effect empowering computers, machines, in many instances to help make decisions that people have always made in the past. So it's really fundamentally important for our generation of people to infuse ethics into this new generation of computing. We then have to address the question, what are the ethical principles that matter? Certainly privacy and security have a fundamental role to play. The fuel for AI is really data sets. The more data, the better the AI model is likely to be. So we better think through the privacy implications and the privacy protection needed to create these large data sets that will move AI forward.
One of the reasons I bring up privacy and security is because some would argue, you look at that and say, well, privacy is great, but if AI is fed through with data, China's got the leg up. They've got millions of surveillance cameras out there, billions of images that are being processed every day. How do you see that shaping up? Essentially, China will have the data with not a whole lot of pushback on the privacy front. Does that mean they have a leg up in the race?
I think two things are very important for the future of technology in China when it comes to AI. First, where I see China really in the lead today is not so much the creation of AI technology, although it's impressive to see what's happening, but in its deployment. So it's going to diffuse it into the economy more quickly. And that in turn will, I think, help companies that are creating AI services here in China. But then second, the whole question of privacy really has two very different sides to the same coin when it comes to China. One side of the coin says companies working in China will benefit because they can get more data with fewer privacy constraints. But there is another side to the coin. If the rest of the world isn't comfortable with the level of privacy protection being applied by companies that are, say, headquartered in China, then they're going to be more reluctant to give those companies access to data. So Chinese tech companies could end up having the world's best collection of data about Chinese individuals, citizens, and very little data about citizens in the rest of the world. And when I talk to, say, people who have their finger on the pulse of what Chinese companies are thinking about, that has become a real concern. And I think it's actually something that we can all look to help promote more of a common conversation and ultimately a global understanding of what it will take to have a level of privacy that the whole world is comfortable with.
Well, so much of the good of AI has been highlighted. As you point out, there's a dark side to that as well. Is somebody who is with a company that's developing a lot of the AI technology, where's the responsibility for Microsoft to make sure this technology is not used in that way?
I think all of us in the tech sector have a responsibility that's really fundamental. I think we have to, first of all, identify the areas where we may contribute inadvertently to problems if we don't do a good job of solving them. One of the questions of the day is how do we reduce bias when it comes to, say, facial recognition technologies? That is the kind of problem that we can help solve directly. But frankly, more of the questions are going to need to be answered by all of us collectively in society. They're going to need to be decided by people in governments around the world. And I think we in the tech sector need to share information. We need to show what we know about where the technology is going. We need to contribute our best ideas. We need to be a voice for the ethical use of artificial intelligence. But I also think we need to recognize something that the tech sector has probably never recognized before. This technology is so important. It is so subject to both good and bad uses that I believe it's going to need a level of government regulation. I don't think we should just sit back and say, oh, leave us alone and everything will turn out all right. This technology is more powerful than that.
Coming up on CNBC Conversation, cracking the Chinese market.
We've sometimes had our frustrations in the past, but I do think that you need to be true to what the market needs.
Microsoft is one of few American tech companies that have found success in the world's second largest economy, but hasn't come at the expense of valuable IP. Microsoft has had a presence in China for more than 20 years, making it one of few American tech companies to have cracked the market successfully. The country is an important part of Microsoft's strategy here in Asia. I asked Brad Smith how the company's navigated some of those restrictions placed on foreign companies operating there.
Let's talk about Microsoft's presence here in Asia, and particularly in China, because Microsoft is, one of the few tech companies that have been able to crack the market. There's a lot of concern about what comes along with doing business in China, and Tim Cook has talked about this before to say, look, if you want to do business in China, you have to go by China's rules. Is that the lesson from Microsoft when you think about the success you've had in the market?
I think that the key in China, and frankly most parts of the world, is to understand what the local market needs and increasingly develop technology that meets those needs. For us, increasingly it means developing technology in China itself. We're very fortunate because we have what we call Microsoft Research Asia, over 3,000 engineers and researchers in a facility that has been in Beijing for 20 years. So we have very deep roots in the engineering and university community, and we're really doing cutting edge research in China itself. So we don't think of China as just a place to sell products. We think of it as a place to help create products. You definitely have to find ways to partner. But I think you need to partner with a sense of where you're comfortable making some adjustments and where you're not. I mean, that is the definition of partnership. Sometimes we've had our frustrations in the past, but I do think that you need to be true to what the market needs, and you need to be true to yourself. That's the only way to really succeed in the long term.
You talk about having the partnerships in place in the market, and on some occasions, Microsoft has partnered with the government to have a Windows 10 government edition. That partnership also requires sharing some proprietary codes. Does Microsoft see that as a risk?
I think that the debate is framed, as you say, about the risks of sharing technology. But I think fundamentally, when you're thinking about software, there's frankly two things you always need to keep in mind, at least in the world in 2018. The first is we live in a world where there's so much open source software. So the risk equation is different when you're sharing code that you're increasingly publishing to the world anyway. The second thing one needs to think about is in the world today, especially in the tech sector. I mean, we compete against the best athletes in the world. And some of them are American, some of them are Chinese. If you're going to compete against the best athletes in the world, you just have to run faster than everybody else, and you have to run to work every day. So yes, there will be days when we might have to provide some more access to technology than we would provide in other places. We need to think it through. We also need to do it with a sense that our success in the long term, frankly, isn't going to turn nearly as much on what we share as our ability to keep running this race faster than everybody else.
What do you make of the way the debate has been framed by President Trump right now, as in the IP theft, the transfer, and these Chinese tech companies advancing on the back of that is a national security risk? Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think one actually should probably separate economic issues from national security issues. I worry that in the world today, there are people in the United States saying that Chinese technology cannot be trusted, and there are people in China saying American technology cannot be trusted. And I think in both countries, we should recognize there is a real risk that the rest of the world might look at the United States and China and say, you know what, you're both right. Nobody should trust the technology from either country. And we need to keep in mind that China, as big as it is, the US as important as it is, together, we only account for 24% of the world's people. We need to serve the 76% of the world that doesn't live in China or the United States. That is, frankly, the key to both countries' success. It doesn't mean that we don't have short-term issues, but we need to look through them, find solutions to them, and continue to nurture this trans-Pacific relationship. It is just too important for both North America and Asia.
Long term, I think a lot of people would agree with you, but I wonder if you think that the skepticism right now of Chinese tech companies is justified in some way, given how things have operated before. You mentioned there is a distrust there. Some would argue, well, it makes sense given the history.
I think that one can always look to the future with a lens that is tied to the past. But I think we need to learn from the past. I don't think we should forget the past, but you can't live in the past. What I find striking about Chinese tech companies today is that these are companies with global ambition. And so they more and more recognize that it might have been one formula to succeed in their early years in China, but it is not a formula that is going to enable them to pursue global leadership on a sustained basis. The only way they'll succeed around the world is if they're trusted around the world. And I increasingly see important Chinese companies taking the kinds of steps that one would expect any company anywhere to take if it wants to be trusted on a global basis.
Still to come, tech regulation and politics. Brad Smith looks back on the antitrust case that nearly crippled Microsoft. Plus, he tells us why he's not afraid to challenge the White House.
We've been very open with people in Washington, D.C., people in Congress, people at the White House. When you have a talented employee, when they bet their career with you to a certain degree, when they make the big bet of living in a new country with their family, we have a responsibility to stand behind these people. We want to continue to attract and retain these people. We're not going to cut people loose. We're going to stand behind them.
Values have helped define this new chapter for Microsoft. The company's been very vocal about politically charged issues like immigration, but it also hasn't shied away from its own mistakes, saying there are valuable lessons from its past.
You were very involved with the antitrust case in the 90s, and I heard you recently say that one of the lessons learned from that was that, sometimes when you're sort of the tech hotshot in the room, it's important to look in the mirror and say that what you see, it may not be what the rest of the world sees. In the context of what's happening today, you think Google and Facebook are making the same kind of mistake?
Well, I think everybody, and that includes all of us at Microsoft, when we're doing well, and we're doing well today, need to remember that when the rest of the world looks at us, they probably don't see somebody that's quite as good looking as we see ourselves when we look in the mirror. We all have our shortcomings. And I think the great underappreciated strength in the world of technology, frankly, is humility. The industry changes so fast. The competitors are so strong that you're much better served if you think about your weaknesses and acknowledge them. And in the world of technology today, I think the world fundamentally is asking us, as an industry that has such an impact around the world, whether we understand the sense of responsibility that inevitably must come with that.
The big discussion in the US right now is about regulation, especially on the back of the data hack with Facebook, the election in 2016. The question seems to be just what kind of regulation or what regulation should look like. At the same time, you've talked about the importance of tech companies self-regulating too. I wonder where you see the divide here.
I think that if you look at how regulation tends to evolve over time, especially in various fields of technology, it often evolves the best when companies do start to think it through. They develop some practices, they share those practices as best practices, they may develop into industry standards. Ultimately, the industry standards then ripen into regulation or law. Well, I would argue that in privacy, people deserve to have their information protected, and companies will be better served themselves if consumers have confidence. Certainly when it comes to cybersecurity, we need more, not just national laws, but international laws, to protect something like that field. You then have to ask, well, then how do we get from here to there? And I think that too requires us to think through a couple of things. First, what's the model? How do we strike the right balance? How do we ensure that fundamental rights are protected but people can innovate so that regulation doesn't freeze technology?
Do you see that coming at the expense of growth for some of these companies? Because some would argue, Microsoft having experienced what it did in the 90s, that brought Microsoft down for a bit.
I think regulation can slow companies down, but if it's done in the right way at the right time, it can sort of inject a level of confidence in the consuming public in the products that they're buying. If regulation actually protects the things that consumers value, if people value the security of their information, the privacy of their information, then regulation need not necessarily slow an industry down.
I want to get back to the values that you talked about. That has been one of the biggest changes that you've seen within the company, because you yourself have been quite vocal on certain issues in the U.S., particularly as it relates to immigration. Why? Why stick your head out in that way?
Well, we've stuck our head well above the parapet on issues that we felt were important either to the success of our business or, in many cases, to the protection of our employees and their families. A tech company at heart is actually not about technology. It's about people. It is a creative company in a way that, frankly, few companies are, because we are trying to move the cutting edge of our products in such a profound way at such a rapid pace. And the truth is, we need to do it not just to serve one market, say the United States, where 4.5% of the world's people happen to live. We need to serve a global market. That's what keeps the company successful. And I would argue that what works for the company is also something that is important for the country. Not necessarily in every way for every issue, but the US has been a technological leader in many fields because the brightest people in the world have wanted to come work in the United States. Their families have wanted to come live in the United States.
There are some other companies like Salesforce, for example, who've pumped more money into their operations in Canada. Is there a point here for Microsoft where you start to consider that? Not talking about leaving the US, but maybe increasing your operations abroad?
Well, I think it's very interesting because within the tech sector, I don't think there's any company that has a higher percentage of its total research and development work in the United States than Microsoft does. Now, at the same time, our biggest R&D center is in Seattle, and Seattle happens to only be 143 miles from Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada. So we have a growing and thriving development center in Vancouver. Most of that doesn't really have anything to do with immigration, but it is a bit of a safety valve, if you will. And we do worry about a couple of the very specific immigration questions that people appear to be debating in Washington. For example, will they deny the ability to work to people who are married to individuals who have an H-1B visa? Those are individuals on what's called an H-4 visa. We have 98 of those individuals who work at Microsoft today. They would lose their ability to work if the White House revokes that authorization. Even more important is what's called optional practical training. It's what allows somebody who graduates from a U.S. university to go to continue to work while they're applying for something like an H-1B. And in the last administration, the White House extended the period of time on which you could do that. But if it's cut back to the way it was before, we would literally have hundreds of employees who would lose their ability to work in the United States. And unfortunately, if they lose the ability to work in the United States, I think we'll have no choice but to. We'll want to do nothing else but help them work somewhere else.
So that safety valve seems to imply that if those employees can't continue to work, you've already had discussions within the company that maybe you move them over to your operations in Canada.
We've been very open with people in Washington, D.C., people in Congress, people at the White House. We've been open with people in the Canadian government. That when you have a talented employee, when they bet their career with you to a certain degree, when they make the big bet of like living in a new country with their family, we have a responsibility to stand behind these people. We want to continue to attract and retain these people. We're not going to cut people loose. We're going to stand behind them. And that was our fundamental message on DACA as well. We were emphatic. We said that if these people have to go through court proceedings to fight deportation, we will stand by their side. We'll represent them in court. We'll help retain counsel. We'll pay for their counsel. I think in the world today, especially in the world of technology, you better stand behind your people because your people are your most valuable asset.
And that wraps it up for this edition of CNBC Conversation. I'm Akiko Fujita in Hong Kong. Thanks so much for watching.